Hello fellow history lovers, welcome back to This Week in British History with me, Philippa Lacey-Bruhl from British History Tours. And this week we are looking at some of the events which happened between the 6th and the 12th of July. We have the accession of Richard the Lionheart to the throne, the coronation of Richard III, and Lady Jane Grey, or should we call her Queen Jane, is pronounced Queen. So let's get started this week with the 6th of July 1189 and the death of Henry II of England. He was succeeded by his son Richard. Richard, who would be Richard I because we had subsequent Richards, but better known as Richard the Lionheart. Now they were still speaking Norman French in the ruling classes at the time, so he was in fact Richard Coeur de Lion. I hope, again, my pronunciation, you know what I'm like by now. But yes, so Richard the Lionheart. That looks like it was actually a subsequent sort of propaganda tool used by his mother when she needed to raise a huge ransom of 150,000 marks to pay off the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who had Richard in captivity. Now, what better way to rouse everyone in England to pay for the ransom of her son, but to give him the persona of somebody worth rescuing? Now, Richard reigned from 1189 to 1199, 10 years. I'm sure you could do the maths there quite easily, and yet he spent only about 6 months in England. He spent most of his time abroad, either on crusades, or it's already spoken about him being in captivity. I'm sure that wasn't by choice, but also defending his lands in France. So really England, he didn't seem to see as a place where he should be and should be ruling, but more of a place where he could raise funds in order to do the other activities that he was undertaking on the continent. Now, any of you who have been to London and been to the Houses of Parliament, Palace of Westminster, we've spoken about that before as well, you will notice, or you may have noticed, that there is a statue of Richard the Lionheart outside the Houses of Parliament. And what's interesting, I know statues have been in the news a lot over the last few years and especially this year. What is interesting about a lot of statues is actually when they were put up. And Richard the Lionheart is a really good example of a period in the Victorian times where there was a nostalgia for history. And you saw a lot of statues going up. And whether there was much thought into who went up, why, I would doubt it in a lot of cases. But Richard the Lionheart got his statue. It's now outside the House of Parliament. It was originally at Crystal Palace, but a bronze version of the statue was created and put outside in Parliament Yard in 1860. Now, a World War II bomb managed to bend Richard's sword, but apparently it has since been straightened out. Now we're moving to 1483, and another Richard, Richard III, had his coronation on the 6th of July. Richard III was the youngest surviving brother of Edward IV of England, who had died in the April. Now, Edward should have been, or was technically succeeded by his 12-year-old son, Prince Edward, Prince of Wales. And Richard should have been their Lord Protector, so he would have ruled over a council that was ruling on behalf of the king whilst he was still a minor. Now, plans were supposed to be in place for Edward to be crowned. He had gone to the Tower of London with his younger brother, which was standard for the monarchs that were about to be crowned. They would go to the Tower of London in preparation for their coronation. However, apparently evidence came to light that in fact their father, Edward IV, had been pre-contracted to a lady called Eleanor Butler when he married Elizabeth Woodville, their mother, and therefore that his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and therefore the children illegitimate. Illegitimate children could not inherit. This left Richard as the heir to the throne. By June 1483, there was a petition which had been raised by the residents of London to have Richard crowned their king, and that was followed by an act in Parliament as well to say that he would inherit and he was king and he would be crowned king. And so Richard and his wife had a joint coronation on the 6th of July 1483 at Westminster Abbey. There was only about 2 weeks in which to organise the celebrations, but apparently there was still a big amount of pageantry and crowds came out to try and catch a glimpse of their new king. Now, I think looking back on successions, we, from our nice, comfortable place in the future, we can sort of look back and say, well, the rightful king was... If you were living at that time, I wonder whether actually a boy king was a option that people wanted to go for. This is what they were hoping was the end of the Wars of the Roses. That was still in living memory. Nobody wanted to go, who would want to go back to civil war and strife, which effectively was just a argument between the top nobility in society as to who should be in charge. This wasn't a civil movement for people's rights. In other words, this is who is in charge. And the population, are going to want stability after decades of that. And so if you look at it from that point of view, I think it's not surprising that people got behind Richard III as their new king. Now, Richard ruled for just over 2 years. The Battle of Bosworth was the 22nd of August 1485, and obviously, famously, Richard III died at that battle against Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII. So Richard wasn't really in power for long enough for us to make any sort of total conclusions as to what kind of king he would have been. But just as an example, he managed in his short reign to pass a bill, I think if that's the right word, in Parliament to standardise weights and measures. Now that may seem sort of an admin task maybe, but this is important for trade and business. Richard also set up something called the Court of Requests, which basically enabled poor people who couldn't normally afford to go to take anyone to court or to defend themselves. They had the opportunity to petition the king for support. It was like a very, very early idea of legal aid. But of course, Richard's story is inevitably entwined with the disappearance of his 2 nephews in the Tower, the princes in the Tower, and what happened to them, and of course the fact that he lost to Henry Tudor on Bosworth battlefield and lost his life, and so was the end of the Plantagenet era came with his death and the beginning of the Tudor one. Just a really quick and fun piece, because this came up when I was doing my research into what happened in This Week in History. Okay, who remembers the Spice Girls' first single? It was called Wannabe, and it was released on the 8th of July 1996, so that's 24 years ago, which apparently makes it history. But then I suppose history is everything that's happened from, last minute to the start of time. So, okay, fair enough. So 24 years ago, Wannabe was released, and the Spice Girls have been a household name ever since. The single topped the UK charts for 7 weeks, but apparently got to the top of the charts in 22 countries in total. Okay, let's go further back now. We're going to go to the 10th of July 1553, when Lady Jane Grey, Queen Jane, was proclaimed Queen of England. She succeeded Edward VI, the son of Henry VIII. He had died actually on the 6th of July at Greenwich Palace, but his death had been kept secret because of trying to get a smooth succession to Jane. Now, Jane was a contentious choice. However, she had been the choice of Edward. Now, Henry VIII had set out in his will his ideas for the succession. And he'd sort of put in a plan A, B, C, D. He'd sort of kept going. And he'd put his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, into the succession. However, he didn't legitimise them. So there was an issue there for Edward that his half-sisters were illegitimate. His eldest sister, out of the two, Mary, was also Catholic. Now, Edward was adamant that the country should be Protestant. We know that a lot of damage happened in religious houses, cathedrals, churches during the English civil wars of the 17th century. But a lot of damage was done in the time of Edward VI as well, including actually damage to Edward's uncle's tomb, Arthur, in Worcester Cathedral. And you may have seen some posts that I've put on about Arthur's tomb in the past. And a lot of the damage to the statuettes there, I'm kind of indicating with my hand here, I'm sort of waving it across my face. The statuettes had their noses cut, they were slashed with swords. I mean, it's quite fascinating to look because you can see the sword marks. Somebody 500 years ago, slashed these statuettes. But he was adamant that the country should completely turn, to Protestantism and remain that way. Now, Mary was going to she was not quiet about the fact that she wanted the country to return to the Pope and return to Roman Catholicism. This was a big consideration for Edward, as to not naming Mary as his successor. The issue with illegitimacy, or there was the issue with Elizabeth. So although she was a Protestant, she was illegitimate. His cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who Edward had hoped would have had children by the time that he died, and hopefully they would be male, but that hadn't happened. He died a lot quicker than anyone could have anticipated. So he named Jane herself as his successor. She was legitimate. Her bloodline, coming from Henry VIII's younger sister Mary, was unbroken, and she was a Protestant. And so for Edward, she was the correct choice. So Jane was proclaimed Queen of England on the 10th of July. She had gone to the Tower of London in preparation for her coronation. By the 19th of July, however, she was there as a prisoner. Mary I had drummed up enough support for Jane to be overthrown and Mary proclaimed Queen of England in London on the 19th of July. Hence, therefore, why Jane is known as the 9 Days Queen, when in fact she actually technically reigned for 3 days longer than that, but there you go. Jane wasn't executed immediately. She wasn't actually executed until the following February. And that was only in response to the failed Wyatt Rebellion. And the Wyatt Rebellion sought to overthrow Mary and put Jane on the throne. Because Mary was returning the country to Catholicism, and there was a lot of kickback from the Protestant population of England. And the rebellion ostensibly was to overthrow Mary and put Jane on the throne. So Jane was a constant threat to Mary while she remained alive. Not her as a person. There's no evidence that she was party to these rebellions, but she was a figurehead for any of these rebellions. Elizabeth would also find herself in hot water as a potential figurehead for these rebellions as well. But Jane could not survive this, and she was beheaded on Tower Green within the Tower of London the following February. Thank you so much for watching this episode of This Week in British History. Please make sure you give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I presume you did if you're here this long. Please subscribe to my channel. Please subscribe to the podcast if you're listening on the podcast. And all the links to my Facebook page, Instagram, Pinterest you can find in the show notes, as well as any links to other interesting things that I think you might enjoy if you've enjoy the topics that we've covered today. But in the meantime, have a great week and I will see you next time.